Starting off today, we are diving into the world of mental asylums. Mental asylums during the Victorian era are definitely not your modern day rehab center. These places were like the catch-all bucket for anyone society didn't quite know how to handle, not just for those grappling with mental illness, but also for people who just didn't fit the very tight Victorian mold. Got a rebellious streak, or just too loud for your neighbor's liking? You might just find yourself locked up in one of these gloomy asylums. And let me tell you, the conditions were nothing short of nightmarish. We're talking about overcrowding, minimal if any real mental health treatment, and methods of confinement that could make even the sanest person question their sanity. It was less about healing and more about hiding away the problematic ones out of society's sight. Imagine being treated more like a prisoner in a dungeon than a patient in a hospital. That was the harsh reality of Victorian mental asylums. Next up on our list today, we have peine forte dure. Imagine being accused of a crime in the not so good old days, and there you are, stubbornly refusing to plead guilty or not guilty because you know the system is rigged. Enter the nightmare fuel of the medieval world. This gruesome punishment method was something straight out of a horror flick. The accused would be laid flat and a board would be placed on top of their chest. Then stones, cold, heavy stones, are piled onto the board one by one. The weight increases, the breathing gets harder, and why endure such torture? It's all because of a loophole. By not pleading guilty or not guilty, the accused could avoid a formal trial, which meant even if they died under the weight, their family could still inherit their stuff. It was a brutal, desperate gamble. Though officially scrapped just before the Victorian era kicked in, the sheer horror of this punishment lingered in the public memory, kind of like the ghost of punishments past whispering, "Be glad you live in the now." Next up, we are journeying over to the gibbet. The gibbet, or gibbeting, was like a horror movie of old school punishments. So picture this. After the execution took place, the criminal wasn't just buried and forgotten about. Nope, that would just be too easy, I guess. Their body instead was sometimes locked up in an iron cage and hung from a tall frame called a gibbet, kind of like a creepy bird cage, but for humans. This wasn't tucked away in some dark corner either. It was of course out in the open where everyone could see it. The body was left to hang there, decomposing in the open air come rain or shine. Why the public display? Well, it was all about scare tactics. The sight of a swinging, decaying corpse was supposed to frighten anyone from thinking about breaking the law. Fair enough. It was a very stark, gruesome reminder plastered right in the town square. Break the law and you could be the next ghastly attraction. Yikes. Talk about a deterrent. I don't think I'd commit any crime after that, actually. It's crazy. Even just like Scared Straight or whatever that show is, like that was enough for me. Just a real dead body hanging in the middle of the town square. So scary. Okay. I don't think I'd do well in the Victorian era, but I guess they wouldn't do well now. Imagine showing like TikTok to a Victorian child. Next up on our list today, we are talking about hulks. Before dedicated prisons became widespread, hulks were a common form of punishment. At first, hulks sounds more like something from like a pirate adventure than real life, but trust me, it was far from a swashbuckling good time. Before the days of modern prisons, these old creaky warships, stripped of their glory and no longer seaworthy, were anchored permanently in harbors to house prisoners. Imagine being crammed into the dank, dark belly of a decommissioned ship with scores of other unfortunate souls. Conditions on these floating prisons were nothing short of nightmarish. They were overcrowded, they were festering with disease, and the air was thick with despair. Prisoners were often put to back-breaking work during the day, maybe hammering away at shipbreaking or toiling in nearby docks or riverbanks, and life on a hull was just a grim, a slow, and a steady descent into misery, making it one of the punishments from the past that was as much about enduring harsh conditions as it was about serving time. Next up on our list today, we have shame. Public humiliation was a go-to tactic in the punishment playbook during the Victorian era, and honestly even before that. Imagine being caught for a petty theft or a public nuisance, and instead of just serving time or getting a ticket, you're slapped with a giant sign spelling out your crime, and then you are paraded around town. Or perhaps you'll find yourself locked in the stocks, stuck in one uncomfortable position in the town square. Here, everyone from cheeky kids to stern old-timers could get a good look at you, and they didn't just stare. Of course not. They jeered, they tossed rotten tomatoes, or worse, sometimes. It wasn't just about making you rethink your life choices, it was about showing everyone else what could happen if they stepped out of line. This kind of punishment turned lawbreakers into live lessons in morality, with a side of entertainment Victorian style. Kinda makes you glad that all you get is a parking ticket these days, right? I'm just saying, alright? Put that in the gratitude journal this morning. Alrighty, let's dive into the grim yet fascinating world of Victorian era hangings with a bit of a casual twist. Imagine a time when Netflix wasn't around and people needed some form of entertainment. Gruesome as it may sound, public hangings were kind of like the morbid blockbusters of the Victorian era. Now, hanging wasn't just a drop in the park, it was a go-to showstopper for very serious crimes. Think of it as the ultimate deterrent, a stark warning that crime doesn't pay, especially not in an era where stealing a loaf of bread could land you in a world of trouble. It went a little something like this. A town crier announces the upcoming execution. I would love to be a town crier. Oh my god. Those guys had all the tea. Just going and yelling at everybody. Oh I really wanted to do a town crier impersonation, but I just can't yell in here. Chris's ears would explode. A town crier announces the upcoming execution. Flyers are posted and word spreads like wildfire. On the big day, people flock from far and wide, creating a carnival-like atmosphere. There are vendors selling snacks, folks jostling for the best view, and an air of anticipation that's hard to miss. The condemned, often paraded through the streets, would then face their final curtain on the gallows, a platform designed for the very purpose of ending lives. The executioner, sometimes hooded, would place the rope around the prisoner's neck, a process watched with bated breath by the crowd. A quick pull of the lever and it was all over. But here's a twist in the tale. Public executions weren't just about punishment, they were also seen as moral lessons. Live action morality plays meant to instill fear and promote good behavior. Yet, the spectacle sometimes backfired. Sympathies occasionally swayed towards the unfortunate soul on the gallows, especially if the crowd deemed their crime petty or their behavior sympathetic. By 1868, Britain decided this was all a bit too much for public sensibilities and moved executions behind the solemn walls of prisons, away from the public's prying eyes and picnics. So next time you're queuing for the latest movie or binge watching a series, spare a thought for the Victorians, for whom a day out might have just involved a bit of gallows theater, complete with real life drama, tragedy, and unfortunately no encore for the star of the show. Ooh. Alright, next up on our list we have flogging. Spare the rod and spoil the child. If you've heard this phrase before, imagine it being taken to the extreme, as they often did in the Victorian era. Flogging wasn't just a quick slap on the wrist, it was a full-on event with the person typically tied up and given a set number of lashes that could leave scars for life. This punishment wasn't exclusive to hardened criminals. Oh no, even some of the more vulnerable members of our communities could get a taste of the whip for acting up. And soldiers or sailors might find themselves on the receiving end for stepping out of line. The idea was that a good thrashing could correct any number of moral or disciplinary issues. Sounds pretty harsh, right? Well, that was Victorian justice for you. Very much about making the punishment fit the crime, with a side of public humiliation to ensure you'd think twice before stepping out of line again. Next up on our list today we have the debtor's prison. Imagine a world where you've just run out of luck with your finances and bam, you're sent off to a debtor's prison, which is about as fun as it sounds. So, not fun at all. These places were grim. Think of the worst hotel you've ever seen, then remove any windows, heating, or good food. In debtors prison, you were stuck until your debt was paid off, but here's where things get even more interesting. How in the world are you supposed to settle your debts when you're locked up and you can't work? It's kind of like trying to run a marathon with your legs tied together. Meanwhile, your family on the outside, yeah, forgot about them, they're just scrambling to get by without their main money earner, which often plunged them into their own financial crisis. Love that. It was just a vicious cycle that didn't do much for actually solving the problem of debt. Instead, it just added a hefty dose of misery and despair to the mix. It sounds like the Victorian era was actually just a lot of that. Misery and despair. So next time you're fretting about paying bills, just be thankful you're not doing it Victorian style, I guess. Or else I'd be in Rogers prison for my phone bill. Next up, we have the scolds bridal. Back in the Victorian era, if a woman was labeled a bit too chatty or opinionated, heaven forbid she actually nag, she might find herself in the not so stylish accessory known as the scolds bridle. Imagine a heavy, clunky metal mask clamping over your head, complete with a gag right in your mouth to put the kibosh on any further chit chat. Okay, not exactly the pinnacle of fashion or comfort, right? This contraption wasn't just about silencing, it was the 19th century version of public shaming with a generous dash of misogyny. Women were paraded around, their speech literally bridled as a warning to others that speaking out of turn wasn't just frowned upon, it was punishable. Thankfully, we've relegated such barbaric practices to the history books, but the scolds bridle remains a stark reminder of how far we've come in understanding and respecting individual rights and voices.
Number 10. Treadmill punishment. While getting on a treadmill today can feel like a punishment in itself, back in the Victorian era, prisoners were assigned to the treadmill as a real punishment. Yeah, you can't get off this one. You would think they're only making prisoners stronger, but there is a method behind this madness. Listen up. The treadmill was invented by Sir William Gibbet in 1818. The treadmill was used not only for grinding corn, but mainly as a punishment. Corn and punishments, my two favorite things. Prisoners would step on 24 spokes of a large paddle wheel, causing it to turn. While originally intended for productive work, it quickly became a form of punishment. Yeah, somebody saw it and was like, you know what? I know how to make this awful. Get on there. The repetitive physical strain of the treadmill made it one of the most dreaded among inmates. Just thinking about a treadmill right now is making my legs shake. Let's move on. Number 9. Amelia Dyer. During the Victorian era, rapid industrialization led to urban expansion, bringing with it increased disease, poverty, and unemployment. All those fun things that make a city. By 1856, the force had expanded to include inspectors tasked with investigating serious crimes. One notable event occurred in 1896 when reading detectives apprehended Amelia Dyer. She was convicted of multiple killings, the worst of the worst, the details of which I can't even say on YouTube or else our channel will get shut down. But the number of lives Amelia Dyer has taken, historians believe that number is around 400. 400, and a lot of them are quite young, by the way. Quite young. If it weren't for the Readingborough police force and that small team of officers, who knows how many more lives would have been lost by the hands of one Amelia Dyer. 8. Transportation. In the 1800s, courts were looking for alternatives to hanging that were harsher than fines but not as brutal as, well, being hanged. Transportation then emerged as a viable punitive option. Initiated in 1717, this practice involved sending convicts away, just sending them away to colonies primarily in Australia at the time, where over 165,000 were transported over 80 years. Now, initially, convicts were housed on decrepit warships with a high mortality rate, of course due to unsanitary conditions, but the majority of those transported were male, ranging from quite young, again, very young, to individuals that were over 80. It could be anyone, these boats were crazy. The journey often included stops in Gibraltar, the West Indies, South America, or the Cape of Good Hope to resupply provisions before reaching various Australian settlements. To which they go, you, get out. Okay, let's do it. Number 7, the crank. Oh, the crank. It sounds easy, but you give it time. Prisoners often endured hard labor such as breaking stones or turning the crank machine, which was a handle that convicts had to turn thousands of times a day, and often for no purpose other than punishment. Yeah, it's like a wheel that'll, not a wheel, it's like a, this is a blooper, me going, it's like a, it's like those old cars where you had to roll the window down manually. It took you like 7.5 minutes. You're like, come on, I'm so hot. There we go, we found it. An example is the case of Oscar Wilde, who was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for gross indecency. Now, his prison experience, especially the hard labor, drastically affected his health and literary productivity. So far, this one here sounds the worst. At least with the treadmill, you got a little bit stronger over time. There's some sort of payoff. But turning a crank for no reason at all, I mean, maybe your one arm would get jacked, but other than that, you're just gonna destroy your body for no reason at all. What a nightmare. The scold's bridle was a sinister instrument of public humiliation from the Victorian era. Now this one really sucked, I'm not gonna lie. We're gonna start cranking it up here, no pun intended. The device was used to punish unruly women who were accused of nagging or gossiping. Yeah, you talk to your friend, now you got the scold's bridle. Enjoy. The scold's bridle resembled an iron cage almost. The bridle enclosed the head of the accused, while some versions featured a spiked or studded plate that was inserted into the mouth to suppress speech and causing, of course, excruciating pain if the wearer attempted to continue to gossip or talk. They were often paraded through the streets and the victim was subjected to public ridicule and scorn. Yeah, scorn. You ever been scorned before? That sucks. Turning the scold's bridle into a dreadful symbol of enforced silence and societal control over women's voices and opinions. This one looks like a saw trap too. This was pretty brutal. It should have been number 1 if anything.
Stand your ground until you can't anymore. The neck tower. This torture and execution was done in 2 ways. Either in a tall, narrow tower or in a tall wooden frame box. Either way, both tower or box could open only from the bottom side. A prisoner is put inside the wooden box frame or tower with only the neck protruding. Hands and feet would be shackled inside and only a towering pile of stones would be in there to stand on. However, each day, a stone or 2 is removed, dropping the prisoner lower and lower and lower by inches over the days, letting them die slowly by strangulation. Battle of the sexes with this torture, it's zanzi, a form of crushing torture used to extract confessions or as a penalization for laws broken. Now may be a fun time to mention that the 5 laws of punishment I had just counted for you guys, those punishments actually only apply to men. For women, the 5 punishments are a different set and far less severe. First is grinding grain, second is the zanzi, which you're about to learn about, third punishment is beating, fourth is confinement, but also sometimes, as mentioned, she got her womb smacked about a little, and finally 5, permission to take your own life. Not them killing you or telling you to do, no. This was some like side-eye, well, we're not telling you what to do, but you know what's up, ... type of thing. Anyways, the zanzi. This finger crusher was a Chinese instrument of torture consisting of small sticks strung together with cords, which was then placed around the fingers and gradually pulled, causing agonizing pain inwards. Think being tricked into playing knuckle breaker by your older brother for the first time. Under traditional Chinese law, a person could not be convicted of a crime unless they confessed. The zanzi was a legal and non-lethal torture method for forcing women to confess, and for men, there was a similar and more painful jiagun ankle crusher, which uses 3-yard-long wooden planks that slowly pulled and compressed the feet in an excruciating fashion that both broke tendon and bone. Time to snatch that waist ancient China style, the waist chop. Waist chopping first appeared in the Zhou Dynasty, and sadly no, it was not truly a plastic surgery alternative to get that slim thick summer look going. In reality, it's when a prisoner is tied to a table, whether lengthwise or widthwise, it doesn't matter. However, it's definitely far less comfortable to be chopped in half while also awkwardly dangling your arms and legs off of a table. Anyways, lying face down, the executioner was to try being the key word, to sever the person in half using a large fodder knife at the small of the back. These big ass knives were literally so heavy, it was more like teetering forward and letting the blade kinda slam into the person and hoping for the best. Sometimes, most times, the chopping was not limited to 1 blow. A story from 1734 describes Yu Hongtu, the education administrator of Henan, was sentenced to a waist chop. After being cut in 2 at the waist, he remained alive long enough to write the Chinese character Chen, which means cruel, 7 times with his own blood before dying. After hearing this, the young Zheng emperor abolished this form of execution. I guess maybe after learning what happened to Hongtu, the emperor felt like half the man he used to be too. Huh? Yeah? We've heard of it before. We'll hear of it again. It's Lingchi, aka slow slicing. A regular torture and execution to reoccur in BumbleBee videos due to how far spread this torture traveled, how much it was used, and just how overall disturbing it is. Slow slicing, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a form of torture and execution used in China from roughly 900 CE up until the practice ended around the early 1900s. The process involved tying the condemned prisoner to a wooden frame, usually in a public place. The flesh was then cut from the body in multiple slices in a process that was not specified in detail in Chinese law and therefore likely varied per empire or century. Generally, it consists of cuts to the arms, then the legs and chest, leading to the amputation of the limbs, followed by decapitation or a stab to the heart. If the criminal was less serious or the executioner more merciful, the first cut would be to the throat. The punishment worked on 3 levels: as a form of public humiliation, as a slow and lingering death, and as a punishment after death. To be cut into pieces meant that the body of the victim was not whole in the spiritual life after death, which is massively consequential to many Chinese people who believed reincarnation required being whole in death. It is described as a fast process lasting no longer than 15 to 20 minutes. The coup de grace was all the more certain when the family could afford a bribe to have the stab to the heart inflicted first. Some emperors ordered 3 days of cutting, while others may have ordered specific tortures before the execution for a longer execution. For example, records show that during Yan Chouhan's execution, Yan was heard shouting for half a day before his death. And finally, the 9 degrees of punishment are 10 shades of effed up. In the words of Mulan's Mushu, alright, that's it. Dishonor, dishonor on your whole family. Make a note of this, dishonor on you, dishonor on your cow. Well, the Qin Dynasty and a few others of China really felt this sentiment with their whole chests, and it shows in the creation of the 9 degrees. See, the punishment involved the execution of close and extended family members. These included the criminal's living parents, the criminal's living grandparents, any children the criminal may have over a certain age, which varied depending on the time period and who was in control and what their definition of a child even was. Also siblings and siblings-in-laws, uncles of the criminal as well as their spouses, and of course the criminal himself. Imagine messing up so bad your whole family line just gets annihilated. We all have that cousin or sibling who would have screwed all of us by now if this still happened. A famous documentation of the 9 degrees is the story of Fang, a Confucian scholar famous for his loyalty to the emperor Zhou. When the emperor is usurped and Fang is asked by the new one to write an inaugural address, well, Fang refuses. It's also ancient China, so realistically he knows exactly what refusal means, so that proves how metal his decision was. Even when threatened with family extermination, Fang showed his IDGAF attitude and is reported saying, "Never mind 9 agnates, go ahead with 10. Blowing steam out the ears, the emperor says, "Bet." And so Fang becomes perhaps the only case of extermination of 10 agnates in the history of China. So quite literally, in addition to his own execution, the blood relations from all 9 branches of his family hierarchy were killed. And as a kick to the nuts, his students and peers were added to be the 10th group. Random people unrelated to him who just happened to attend his lectures or work with the guy. Although altogether 873 people are said to have been executed. Because this guy refused to write a speech and when threatened said, "Do it bro, I dare you." Before death, Fang was forced to watch his brother's execution, and then Fang himself was executed by waist cutting. And legend goes that prior to his death, he dipped his finger in his own blood and wrote on the ground the Chinese character Quan, which means usurper. Man was petty until the end and took 873 people with him to prove it. Also, they liked writing in blood a lot. Is the elephant. Those same guys that you watch paint at the zoo or roll around in the mud are the same hardcore MFs that used to be weapons of war in South and Southeast Asia. While elephants were no strangers to the battlefields, they were a common capital punishment method as well, called the gungoreo. As they were smart and easily trainable, they could be used to crush, dismember, or overall torment captives in very public death sentences. The earliest record of death via elephant dates back to the classical period. However, the practice was already well established by that time and continued well into the 19th century. The most common way that the execution by elephant was carried out was the obvious: crush its victim to death with brute force. But elephants were even sometimes used in a kind of trial by ordeal where the condemned prisoner is released if he manages to fend off the elephant for long enough. The Mughal Emperor Akbar the Great is said to have used this technique to chastise rebels, and then in the end the prisoners prisoners, presumably much chastened, were given their lives. So this obviously tells you that aside from enemy soldiers, civilians who commit certain crimes could also be punished in this brutal way. These crimes included theft, tax evasion, heresy, and rebellion. During the expedition to central India in 1868, Louis Rousselet, a French writer, photographer, and traveler, described a death sentence of a criminal by elephant. The sketch was made of the event showing the condemned being forced and placing his head on a pedestal and then being held there, while the elephant foot crushed his head. Yeah. So, punishment number 9 is branding, a global classic. Who in the ancient world wasn't branded B-words for doing stuff they didn't want them to do? Now, in Euro nations, it was usually women or servant workers getting marked up, but in India, it was also a punishment for things other than being caught with your pants down, literally. See, how they liked to do it was the culprit was branded with a hot iron, smack dab in the center of their forehead with the words describing the offense. If you stole eggs, they will brand "stole eggs" on your face, which is equally hilarious and embarrassing. So I guess the shame part would really actually work there, especially because this branding punishment always came with a reduction of social class too. This method was commonly used in classical societies. In India it was practiced during the Mongol rule, and it since has been completely abolished. Punishment number 8 is pillory. This device was shared between a few nations. The Europeans loved this crap and used it on women constantly. As you may know from the BumbleBee videos, top 10 spine-chilling ways women were punished in medieval times, part 1 and 2. If you haven't seen those, maybe go check them out on our channel and subscribe to the Hive while you're at it so you don't miss out on anything else. In pillory, the offender was compelled to stand in a public place with his head and hands locked in the iron frame so that he couldn't move. Uncomfortably hunched over, the victim would then have his ears nailed to the pillory through the top cartilage, so his head is forced up on an angle, adding to the uncomfortable position of the spine. It would essentially be like this. Then finally, the victim would be whipped, branded, or stoned. However, if the victim was super hella dangerous, I don't know, maybe he was like a top soldier, turned evil, but had really good battle skills, and they had to be concerned about that, they'd use the pillory just to restrain him while they physically nailed the guy's actual body to a wall, then stoned them. This was practiced till the 19th century. Punishment number 7 is lost limbs. In other words, it means damaging a person severely, especially by removing a part of the body. It's another classic amongst the medieval societies, and like others who like to cut limbs off as punishment, it was usually the nose, ears, hand, or feet in India. Whatever the crime was determined the limb lost. During that period, one or both of the hands of a person were chopped off if the offender committed theft. If he indulged in intercourse offenses, such as violating someone, his privates were cut off. That one still happens nowadays, just usually once the prisoner is already in jail. Not done by the government. Anyways, back to it. If he told a lie or criticized God, his tongue would be cut off, and if he was deceitful or untrustworthy, his ears were cut off. Punishment number 6 is brain ablaze. So, in ancient India, it turns out another fun punishment was to have certain parts, but only parts, of your body set on fire. This punishment came in alongside the upheavals of ancient Indian political history, wherein kings and dynasties faced endless threats and challenges from rivals. Enough so that, like all kingdoms, violence against the king became a serious political problem that had to be dealt with ruthlessly and effectively through preemptive action, punishment, and retaliation. The punishment for one who reviles, spreads evil news about the king, or reveals council secrets is punished with tearing out the tongue, as aforementioned. More severe crimes against the king and kingdom, however, invite more severe punishment. Death by setting fire to the hands and head is a punishment for one who covets the kingdom, forces entry into the king's harem, attacks the king's palace, aids his enemies, incites forced people or enemies, or causes a rebellion in a fortified city, countryside, or army. The man is restrained, his head and hands doused in sulfur or another flammable, and lit ablaze. Imagine a time and a place where asking some folks, hey, you want to get dinner and drinks, would get you executed. The Han food restrictions. The Han Dynasty had some fickle little food laws and regulations, it appears, and for some reason they had wild punishments for them. For example, the law stipulates that dinner without a valid reason will be fined if caught, and if there's beef on the table, it will be cut directly. Does that do something to the beef? I don't get that part. I also don't get the part where between 206 BC and 220 CE, having a few drinks with the boys could get you literally decapitated. The law stated that if 3 or more people got together to drink, the participants would be fined 4 tals of gold. If you're unable to pay, obviously you face severe consequences, because why can you afford to drink but not pay a fee? The only exception to this rule were gatherings such as weddings, funerals, and festivals. Many rulers and dynasties attempted to regulate the consumption of alcohol in some part because making alcohol required grains like rice, and that supply was often short. Rulers also feared that drunken civilians could easily turn disorderly and violent and cause some peace issues. Can't talk unusual and freaky without bringing up the Mongols and their Yasa law. The Yasa decrees are only available to us through secondary sources, as there's no comprehensive Mongol scroll or codex found so far. Naturally, this can be problematic, and our knowledge of Yasa law is nothing like the older code of Hammurabi. This is due to the fact they weren't literate, so yeah, the laws were told verbally. What we know of Yasa, declared by Genghis himself, is it concerned itself with people, not property, and aimed for three things: obedience to Genghis Khan, a binding together of nomenclats, and merciless punishment of wrongdoing. Nowadays, we've managed to collect some of their laws together, and I'm gonna read you some of this list. So, we have urinating in water or ashes is punishable by death. One may not dip their hands into water and must instead use a vessel for drawing water. Probably a hygiene thing, but at least it's not death, you know? It's forbidden to wash clothing until completely worn out, and don't forget, when you do go to wash them, it's forbidden to bathe or wash garments in running water during thunder. I can't make sense of that one. And then also there's the one where parents can arrange a marriage between their children even if one or both are already dead. But the weirdest thing aren't even the articles, it's the penalties. Only death is ever specified as a consequence. Adultery, death. Take someone against their will, death. Peeing in water, death. Don't answer con calls, death. Giving out food or clothing to captives, death. Death, 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 death. Now, it also includes some pretty chill laws, like Genghis ordered that all religions to be respected and no preference be shown to any of them. So, I mean, you win some, you lose some. Up next is like country boys at Boots and Hearts. You gotta chug, chug, chug. This law and punishment comes to us from the Sui Dynasty of China, which the duration was 581 to 618 BC. If you've seen some of my videos about ancient China, you may know that getting into the royal court for work could be pretty blessed for you, your biddy, and any kids or family you have. Some parents went as far as to snip their kids' junk so they could potentially be a eunuch for their emperor in the future. If you don't want to do that, you could always take the imperial exam, the Keiju, which theoretically allows anyone in the country to become a government official. But failing the test was not without consequence, especially if you weren't neat. According to the Book of Sui, the official historical records of the Sui dynasty, the laws stipulated that examinees with bad handwriting would be punished by being forced to drink 1 sheng of ink, aka a literal liter. Don't think you can drop out either once you learn that and you know you can't improve your handwriting in time. The penalty for dropping out is also to chug down some ink. Why so extreme over some exams? Well, exam answers were in theory written by the emperor, even though in practice his officials would be the ones doing the grading. So even if the emperor didn't see it, bad handwriting indicated disrespect to him, the son of heaven. Also, if you failed the examination, guess what your punishment is? Drink some more ink. Had to throw something violently nauseating in on this list at some point, so we got death by Dumbo. This is gonna be rough, you guys, and it makes it obvious colonies of Asia were not effing around. Hope you're ready. So, elephants were used to crush and even gore criminals to death in medieval South and Southeast Asia. This method was popular in India from the Mughal period into the late 19th century. The criminals were laid down either face down, a blessing, I imagine, or face up to see their incoming demise, which was wild angry elephants, who ran over them repeatedly, ensuring a quick yet very painful death. The most common form, however, was mano a mano, when a convict was laid down and an elephant walked over to the execution site by the handlers and deliberately made to stamp on the torso or head. Elephants are clever creatures, and reportedly they could be taught to slice and gore criminals to death with pointed blades fitted to their tusks. Imagine an elephant in a blind rage running at you with butcher knives duct taped to its tusks, because that's literally what their last moments would have been like. Alright, let's talk mud now. Not any old mud, it's mud. The glorious mud. Gonna say mud way too much, it's gonna feel made up. So, execution by suffocation was a common practice of the ancients. Look at hanging, or whack stuff, like water torment. However, in the medieval period, a very strange kind of suffocation technique was used called mud, the glorious mud. And yes, you have to say it like that, so follow me on screen. Mud, the glorious mud. Yay! Okay, I'll stop. So, some historians tell us that criminals would be killed by throwing him or her into a pit of stinky mud, usually also packed with human filth and feces, because this is medieval Europe. The convict would either die by drowning or by suffocation. However, this was also a common accidental death for the exhausted armor-laden soldiers laying injured on battlefields. Anyways, being drowned or suffocated in mud for punishment does seem to have been rare, thankfully, primarily known to happen in the Burgundy region of France, where it was a punishment reserved specifically for women who left their husbands.